Maybe. Good evening. I hope all of you are doing well. We are learning Maseches Yevamos, Daf Zayin. And so we're learning Daf Zayin, and we're starting about 12 lines down or so on Zayin Amud Aleph. And we're actually in the midst of a sugya. We've been discussing over the last many days, the Gemara is trying to figure out why the pasuk in Chumash had to go out of its way to use the word aleha to teach us that in a case where a man's daughter was married to his brother, why he should not do yibum. It should be pretty obvious. There's a pasuk in Chumash. So the Gemara is positing that maybe because of asay dochelosa asay, that because asay dochelosa asay is generally true, so therefore, even though it's true that his daughter but because asay is dochelosa asay, so I would have thought that it's mutter for him to marry her, maybe even a chiyuv, and therefore we needed the word aleha. So we're in the middle of a brisa that the Gemara began with at the bottom, really at the base, about misas bezdin, that maybe by misas bezdin we could learn from there. So there are a couple of different versions of this, and yesterday we had concluded like the second approach, like the approach of Rav Simi Bar Ashi, who's quoted 3 lines from the bottom of Vavamud Beis, who indicated that this brisa was not talking about asay dochelos asay, but rather it was talking about a kal v'chomer. But the Gemara wants to go back to the Havamina, and that's where we're starting now, 12 lines down on Zayin Amud Aleph. Ulamai desalik adaite meikara. And according to our initial understanding of the brisa that's found on Vavamud Beis, to asi asay v'dachilos asay. If that's true, that in the Havamina of that brisa, that we can assume that an asay is dochelos asay. So the Gemara says, my quote o eno end quote Amar. What then was the brisa doing when it flipped back and forth? Now, if you look back at the brisa, which is 2/3 of the way down on Vavamid Beis, it gave an idea, and then it said, "O eno ella afilu misas bezdin," and then it flipped back again. So what the Gemara is doing now is saying within the Havamina that brisa was talking about asay dochelos asay, what was the subtext of the flipping back and forth from saying Shabbos will be doche for misas bezdin to it will not be doche to it will be docha. So the Gemara says, my o eno de kamar, and the Gemara responds as follows: Hachi kamar, mani mekayim mechalaleha mosumas. We're going to look back at the brisa, but we're not going to ourselves look back. This Gemara is looking back at that brisa and saying, what does the pasuk teach me about mechalaleha mosumas? It's teaching me b'shar malachos chutz mi misas bezdin. A person will be killed for violating Shabbos with all malachos on Shabbos, with the exception of al misas bezdin dachi Shabbos. But there, the murdering, the killing of, the execution of people who are deserving, that is Mechal Shabbos. Why? To asi asay v'dachi los asay. Because we have an asay to kill this person with the capital punishment that they deserve, even though it's Shabbos. And then when the Gemara says, oh, eno, maybe not on Shabbos, you're not allowed. What is the subtext? So the Gemara says, Hadar Amar, Amar de Amrin anta asi asay v'dochelos asay. When do we say that one is allowed that an asay is going to be doche los asay? That's true with a los asay greda. That's true with a regular los asay. However, in this case, being mechal Shabbos is not a regular los asay. That's a los asay sheyesh bo kares mishamas le'dedachi. Is there such a scenario where we would have a mitzvah asay that would allow us to trump a los asay sheyesh bo kares? And that's what's happening here in the misas bezdin. So that's the middle of the brisa. And then Hadar Amar, and then the Gemara flips back a 3rd time and says, Hadar Amar, atu asay dochelos asay. We do see that an asay is dochelos asay. Lav los asay chamor mine. Don't we know that in general that a lav is more powerful than an asay? And if it's true that an asay can be doche any los asay, then says the Gemara, who cares how strict of a los asay it is? Again, here's the ranking. The least severe is an asay. You violate an asay, an isser asay. After that is a regular los asay, and after that is the los asay sheyesh bo kares. So the Gemara argues as follows: once we know that an asay is doche any kind of los asay, even a los asay grade, even a regular one, who cares how much more chamor it is? Kares, not kares. That's the Gemara's logic here. Lav los asay chamor minei. Don't we know that a los asay is more chamor than an asay? And if so, v'ka'asi asay v'dachi los asay, and therefore we know that an asay can trump at times a los asay. Mali chumra zuta, mali chumra rabba. Who cares as to what the reason is, how severe the los asay is relative to the asay? It doesn't matter. So therefore, I might have had a havamina that maybe, just maybe, we have a case of asay dochelos asay sheyesh bo kares, and therefore back to our case Therefore, a father would have to marry his daughter in a case of yibum because aseh is dochelos aseh b'makom kares. Says the Gemara, Talmud lomar lo sivaru. Then that's why we needed the pasuk. So that was this version of the Gemara. Now we don't hold like this version of the Gemara. We hold like the version of the Brisa that was speaking about kal v'chomer and not about aseh dochelos aseh. So that the Gemara is just, this is really a tangential aspect of the Gemara, which is just trying to understand the flow of the Brisa according to the opinion that the Brisa was speaking about aseh dochelos aseh. Either way we cut it, this Brisa is not a good argument for us. It doesn't explain why we need the word aleha, because at the end of the day, this Brisa is not talking about aseh dochelos aseh. If that's true, we need to go to our fourth answer. Our fourth possibility as to how we know why we need the word aleha in the pasuk to teach me that a father cannot marry a daughter in a case of yibum. Ela itzrich, because sal kadaita chamina tehave hai eshes ach. This case where we're talking about the wife of a brother, so that's Shimon. This is a regular boring case of yibum, right? So like, let's say you have two brothers, Reuven and Shimon, and Reuven is married to a completely unrelated woman named Chana, and then Reuven dies. Then Shimon, that's classical case of yibum. So says the Gemara, tehavi hai eshes ach. The case scenario where we allow a man to do yibum, normally it's his sister-in-law. That's really not allowed in general, but we do allow for that to take place here. And what is that? We're familiar, of course, with the Yud Gimel Midos She'ator Nidreshes Bahin, and we're going to have a little bit of a learning session tonight on this topic. And says the Gemara that the case of our classical case of yibum, where a father marries a brother, is a case of davar shahaya bichlal v'yatsa min haklal alamed. Really, eshes ach, that really should have been included only in the parshios that speak about arayos in general. But it was explicated elsewhere in the Torah to specifically tell us about yibum. But it wasn't brought out. Lo lelamed al atzmo yatsa. We're halfway down on Zion about Aleph. It wasn't there to teach me about itself, about the case of eshes ach. Why was the case of eshes ach separated? Only Ella l'lamed ala klal kulia, to teach me something in general. And now the Gemara is going to give a brisa that is an example of this hermeneutical principle, one of these Yud Gimel Midos She'ator Nidreshes Bahin, which is davar shahaya bichlal v'yatsa min haklal l'lamed lo l'lamed al atzmo yatsa ela l'lamed ala klal kul yatsa. D'Tanya. What is an example of this where we see that something is separated from the pack in order to teach me something in general about the halacha? D'Tanya. Davar shahaya bichlal v'yatsa min haklal. If there was something that used to be part of the pack, part of the general category of halachos, but then the Torah explicitly speaks about it elsewhere, Ketzad, what's an example of that? So the Gemara gives an example based on a pasuk in Chumash in Sefer Vayikra. If a person eats the meat of shlamim and he was tamei, says the Gemara, why bother even writing this? Hello, shlamim bichlal kachim hay. We already spoke about kachim. We don't need to speak about shlamim. Lama yatzu. Why was shlamim brought out? Why was it explicitly stated in Chumash? Lahaki shalehen, to make a comparison. V'lomar lach ma shlamim meyuchadim kachim izbeach af kol kachim izbeach. The reason why we brought out shlamim was to give us a parameter, to give us the common denominator of cases where the tuma really applies. And what is that rule? That applies in cases of kache mizbeach. However, yatsu kache bedek habayis, that if something was purchased with money from bedek habayis, that has a different and lower halachic status of tuma when the money is taken from the general pot and not from kachim, and therefore you cannot learn from there. This is an example of a case of davar shaheh bichlal v'yatsa min haklal l'lamed. And hachanami, here too by the case of yibum, we have the same hermeneutical principle in place. What was the details? Ha'eshesach, the case of a classical case where Shimon is going to now marry Reuven's widowed wife, the widow of Reuven because he died. Eshesach bichlal kol ha'arayos. So we know that in general a sister-in-law is included in arayos. The lama yatzisa. Why was this case explicitly stated by the Torah? We're 2/3 of the way down on Zion Amud Aleph. Says the Gemara, lahaki sheleha v'lomar lach, to teach us a comparison to say the following. Ma eshes ach sharia. Just like in this case, yibum is allowed because there's a pasuk that says yibum is allowed, even though normally eshes ach is part of arayos. Af kol arayos nami sharia. Therefore, all cases of arayos should then be permitted. What the Gemara is saying here is that's the havamina. I might have thought, based on a hekesh from eshes ach, that all other versions of arayos are going to be perfectly permissible, even one's daughter. Therefore, we need the pasuk of aleha. And says the Gemara, what are you talking about? How can you compare eshes ach to someone who's an arayos to you? Let's think how the Gemara speaks this out. Midami. Can you really make a hekesh from a case of Eishes Ach? Again, the classical case. A man is, Reuven is married to, Reuven is Shimon's brother, and Reuven's married to a random woman, and then Reuven dies. So Shimon can marry the random woman. He's not related to the random woman. So says the Gemara, how can you compare Eishes Ach, where he's not related, to Arayos? That's your daughter. That's your sister. That's whoever it is. Doesn't make any sense. Me dummy, how can you compare these things? Hassam, over there, Klal be'isr, Uprat be'isr. Over there in Chumash, we're talking about something that's generally usr. Sorry, not over there by the Korbanos, we're talking about something that's generally usr. And in Parad be'isr, and even when the Shlamim is separated from regular Korbanos, we're also saying that it's usr. But Hacha by Yibum, Klal be'isr, yes, in general, it's forbidden to be with them. But the Prat, the Eishes Ach that was explicit in the Torah, that's beheter. That you're allowed to marry that person, but your daughter you're not allowed to marry. The cases are not comparable at all. And therefore, we don't really have an explanation as to why we need the word aleha. Because according to this logic of trying to learn from this hermeneutical principle, it would come out that an Eishes Ach is not comparable to Arayos, because the relationships are very different, and therefore we cannot make such a hekesh. And therefore, hello dummy, this case, the case that we are talking about now, the case of Eishes Ach, is not comparable to a case of Davar Shaheh Bichlal, but rather to a different type of one of the hermeneutical principles. Ella, it's most similar to the Davar Shaheh Bichlal, something that was included, similar language as before. However, the Yatza Lidon B'Davar Hechadash, it came to teach me a chiddush, not to teach me a rule that applies across the board. It came to teach me a chiddush. And you can't make this klal, this new rule, go back to the general category of halacha. It's only specific to the case that's explicitly stated. And now we're going to see an example of this hermeneutical principle, and then we'll apply it back to our case. The Tanya, the Brisa writes, what is a case of davar shahaya bichlal, a large category of halacha that the Torah speaks about, and then one sample of that is the yatz lidon badavar hechadash. One example is brought out to teach me a chiddush, and we cannot apply that chiddush to other parts of the larger category, unless the Torah explicitly tells us to do so. Ketzad. What is the case that we're talking about that is an example of this hermeneutical principle? If you look in the art scroll, the English art scroll on the bottom, by the Yud Gimel Midos Shator Nidreshes Bahin by Rabbi Shmuel in the mornings. So there, they'll give you a full explanation of samples of all of the Yud Gimel Midos Shator Nidreshes Bahin. And they get, I don't know if this one's quoted. It should be, because it's a pretty, one we're about to see, is a pretty classical example. By the way, the Rishonim are very, very strong about saying Rabbi Shmuel in the morning. The Abu Dram and other Rishonim indicate that when in the mornings we say Rabbi Shmuel, we are fulfilling the dictum in Shas of being mishalish limudo, splitting your learning into thirds. You have Mikra, Mishnah, Talmud, Parshas HaTamid, Ezu Mekomon Shel Zvachim, and Rabbi Shmuel, which is a brisa. So you have Mikra, which is Parshas HaTamid. Interesting, not because of Korbanos, only because of the being mishalish limudo. Halacha l'maisa, we say Parshas HaTamid, we should be saying it every single day. If you've already said Shmon Esrei, you've technically already brought your korban. So saying the psukim would only be saying psukim and chumash, which is always a mitzvah. But to say that you really said the tamid is not right. We should make it a habit. And don't forget to say the Parshas HaTamid. But anyways, the Abu Dram writes, not here, but elsewhere, that the idea of saying Rabbi Shmuel is to be mishalish limud of Mikra, Mishnah, Talmud, Korban Tamid, Ezum Mekom Shel Zvachim, and Rabbi Shmuel. Anyways, what is an example of this hermeneutical principle? The Gemara says in regards to a case of an asham mitzora, a korban that's brought by a mitzora. V'shachat es hakeves b'makom asher yishchat es hachatas v'es ha'olah b'makom hakodesh. A person should shech this keves, which again, as Rashi here mentions, is an asham mitzora, and he should do so in the place where he shechs zachatas and an olah b'makom hakodesh, in a holy place. And then the pasuk adds in the following words: Ki kachatas ha'asham, just like the chatas is an asham. Now, if you read the first part of the pasuk, we know that already because we just said you got to do it in the same place. Just like this is that. So the Gemara is bothered by the language. Let's just finish the pasuk. Ki kachatas ha'asham hu la kohen. She'ein Talmud lomar kachatas ha'asham. I don't need you to tell me that the asham is like the chatas. The pasuk told me that the asham is like the chatas. Not everyone's an Amars. I can read Hebrew. It's clear that there's a similarity already. Why bother saying it? What do we see from this extra words in the pasuk? So says the Gemara. Lefisha yatsa asham mitzora lidon bedavar hechadash. Really, what was going on here is that the Torah was explicitly talking about a case of an asham mitzora. Why? Because there's a chiddush there. Remember that's this type of hermeneutical principle. It's a case of davar shahaya bechlal v'yatza lidom b'davar chadash. What was the new thing that we did over here by Metzora? Says the Gemara, bohen yad ubohen regel hayamanis. That we have a unique purification process of thumbs and hand thumbs and toe thumbs. So that's what the Gemara says. It's a chiddush. Yachol, and maybe I would have thought that the general rules no longer apply to an Asham Metzora. Maybe I would have thought, Lo Yehei Taun Matan Damin Ve'emurim Lagabe HaMizbeach. Maybe I would have thought that by this animal, we don't have to bring those extra gifts, those extra sprinkles of blood, and the Emurim on the Mizbeach. Talmud Lomar, Ki Kachatas Ha'ashamhu. It has to be just like the Chatas. Ma Chatas to Unamatan Damin Ve'emurim Lagabe Mizbeach. Just like the Chatas has these special things that are taken care of, korban-wise, the sprinklings of blood and the fats of the animal being burned. Okay, very good. So we see that. Why did the pasuk say kachatas ha'asham? To make sure that we don't erroneously think that once we singled out the case of Metzora because of bohen yad and bohen regel, maybe I would have thought that the regular rules of matan damim and emurim don't apply. Says the pasuk kachatas ha'asham. It has to be just like the chatas. V'ilo ahadre kra. But if not for the fact that the pasuk had said ki kachatas ha'asham, havamina, I might have thought l'mayda nafak, that for that which the Metzora was specifically singled out, namely to teach me about bohen yad and bohen regel, only that applies. Ulamayda lo nafak. But with that which the pasuk doesn't speak about, namely the emurim and the matan damim, I might have thought it didn't apply. So says the Gemara, from here we can make the following jump. Hachanami by yibum also. Havamina, I might have thought eshes ach the ishteroi, that the only in a classical case, Shimon is a brother to Ruvain. Ruvain's married to Penina, a random girl from the community. Ruvain dies, Shimon can marry the random girl. So I would have thought that only that case is mutter, but she'ar arayos lo. I would have thought in such a case that a regular woman, of course, you cannot marry, and that is really the right way to understand the concept of Eishes Ach. And if that's true, then I don't need the pasuk of Aleha at all, because the implications from the pasuk is that you would never allowed to be married. You were never allowed to marry an arayos. So the Gemara says you're absolutely right. And now we're on to our fifth answer. This answer will take us to the bottom of the page. At least most of it will. We'll pick up again. We're still not done with this sugya yet of trying to determine. By the way, we've learned, I'd say, a few thousand words to try and explain one in Chumash. Why does the pasuk bother saying the word aleha to teach me that a man cannot marry a woman of arayos, his daughter, or any woman from arayos? After all, I say dochelos, I say 100 reasons why. We still haven't figured it out. So we're up to our fifth answer and our fourth blot, I believe. So let's keep going. We're a third of the way down, 10 lines down or so, a little bit less on Zayin Amud Beis. Ella, it must be that salka daita chamina, it must be that I might have thought, namely, I have the word aleha to teach me that a daughter cannot be married in Yibum, that I might have thought the following: Teisi b'mematzinu me'eshesach. A mematzinu is basically a hekesh of sorts. Just like I found something over here, I can apply it over there from eshesach. And here's what the Gemara says: Ma eshesach miyavma. Just like Shimon can marry Ruvain's wife once Ruvain dies if she's a random woman, even though it's a sister-in-law, which otherwise should be usher. Just like that, af achos isha tisyabe, even if it's the case that it's someone who's also an arayas to you. So says the Gemara, that's ridiculous. There's no comparison. That woman, in case number one, Ruvain died and he married random girl from another community. She's a Giores. Who cares? She's totally not related. There we said that he can do Yibum. How can you compare that to an Arayos? Me, dummy. Hasam Chadi Surah. By the Eshes Ach, where Shimon is going to marry Ruvain's random woman wife after Ruvain dies, she only had one status of Isser, which was Eshes Ach. But in the case of Achos Isha, that's Trei Isurei. So you can't compare that at all. So says the Gemara, no, you can't. You can, even though you're right that the case of Eshes Ach only has one level of Isser, and that it's a sister-in-law, even though she's not Arayos. I mean, she's Arayos in that way, but she's only Arayos once over, but not in two ways. But still, I might have thought that it's enough of a reason to be concerned that one should think you could marry your daughter, and therefore we need the word Aleha. Ma'udatema, I might have thought, Hoel ve'ishtere. Once we have a heter by any version of Arayos, we have a heter for Yibum by all versions of Arayos. And therefore, we need the word aleha to teach me that no, that's not true. You cannot marry a daughter in the framework of Yibum. So then says the Gemara, where did you get this idea from? What does it mean that just because it's mutter by Eshes Ach, that it's also mutter by Achos Isha? They're different types of isurim. One only has one layer of arayos, and the other has two. That you just get to say that just because, like by Eishes Ach, we allow arayos. So therefore, in a case where there's two levels of arayos, that's allowed. That's ridiculous. That's crazy. Why would we think that? What's the Habamina? So says the Gemara, a beautiful Marimakom. Well, we'll see. It's seemingly beautiful. The Tanya. The Brisa writes in regards to a Mitzorah. Mitzorah Shachal Shmini Shelo Be'erev Pesach. We have a Mitzorah who currently is Mechutzar Kippurim. He's not allowed to bring a Korban Pesach, but he really, really wants to. Here's what happened. His 8th day is on Erev Pesach. He just has to wait for the sun to set. He has a Tvul Yom, and then that night he can go to the mikvah. And that night he can reshech the Korban Pesach. And then unfortunately, V'ra Keri bo bayom v'tabel. He saw Keri that day, which is a problem. A Bal Keri is not allowed in the Makom HaMikdash, and therefore he's stuck. Because now he's a Tvul Yom again, a double Tvul Yom. So says the Gemara, Amru Chachamim. The rabbis told us in this brisa, Af al pi that in general she'ein Tvul Yom achar nichnas ze nichnas. Even though in general it's true that a Tvul Yom would lose out on the possibility of bringing a Korban Pesach because he's now a Tvul Yom for Keri, Zeh, this guy who's exiting his Mitzorah status today, who doubles over and becomes a Bal Keri today and goes to the mikvah, and he's a double Tvul Yom, we let him go to bring the Korban Pesach. And the Gemara gives the following rationale. Mutav, it's better sheyavo asay sheyesh bo kares, that he should do the mitzvah asay which has an iser kares attached. Namely, there are only two in the Torah, bringing the Korban Pesach. I'd rather this guy who's a double Tvul Yom bring the Korban Pesach, which is a mitzvah asay that has kares, v'yidche asay she'ein bo kares, and override a mitzvah asay that doesn't have kares.
What about Pesach Sheni?
Well, why isn't this onus? But here the Chachamim are saying that we don't care. You're doing it now. That's a good question. I didn't think about that. That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. Tosfos says here, 3 lines into the very thick lines, Dibra masal mutav yavo asay sheyesh bo kares lav milsa de psikahi. This is not how we paskin. This is not halachic. There are times where we do have the chachamim standing up to what's going on b'makom kares, so we don't paskin this way. But the Gemara is bantering right now and showing you one kula in one brisa that the chachamim say, but it's not halacha l'maisa. Seemingly, it's not halacha l'maisa. So the Gemara now is equating something new. We haven't thought about this before. You have a mitzvah saseh, which has kares attached to it, against a mitzvah saseh that doesn't have kares attached to it. Shouldn't that be obvious? It should be obvious. You have 2 mitzvahs saseh, one has kares, one doesn't. It should be very obvious. The Gemara says it's a cheshbon, and the Chachamim did not allow it, like Tosfos says here, and like the Gemara implies, that there are other cases where the Chachamim don't say such a thing. The Amar Rav Yochanan, we're 7 lines from the bottom, Amar Rav Yochanan, Davar Torah, he says the halacha is, afilu aseh leisbei. He says, no, this isn't the cheshbon at all. This guy who's a Tvul Yom, there isn't even an aseh. So now you have the mitzvah aseh sheyesh bo kares of bringing the Korban Pesach, and you have a din d'Rabbanan, a non-mitzvah aseh of not going to the mikdash when you're at Tvul Yom. Shneimar vayamod Yehoshaphat bekal Yehuda lifnei chatzera chadasha. Says the Gemara, my chatzera chadasha. He's standing in front of the new chatzer. Amar Rav Yochanan shechid shuba dvarim. This was at a time when the Chachamim sat down and they came up with new halachos. One of them was v'amru. They said Tvul Yom lo yikanis lamachane leviyah. So says the Gemara, v'amar ula matam. Why is this the case? Hoel v'hutar litzar aso, because we allowed the guy, the Mitzorah, because we allowed him, so hutar likruyo. We also allow the person who's a Bal Keri. And this is where we see the principle of hol v'ishtari. Once we have the leniency by Mitzorah to say, yes, he's a Tvul Yom, but we'd rather him show up and bring the Korban now because it's an aseh sheyesh bo kares against an aseh she'ein bo kares. We do the same thing for Keri as well. So therefore, we see our principle of hol v'ishtari, and therefore, maybe, just maybe, the Gemara's presentation a third of the way down with this 5th possible answer is that just like by Eishes Ach, we see that a man is allowed to marry his sister-in-law after his brother dies, even though she's technically an arayos. So maybe we extend that to other people who are also arayos, even if they have multiple layers of arayos, such as a daughter who's also a sister-in-law. Real family triangle. That's a soap opera right there. But the Gemara is saying is that maybe we should allow for this marriage to take place, and therefore we need the word allow. We'll stand right here at the bottom of the page. We'll pick up with the words midami tomorrow night for Daf Ches. Wishing you all a beautiful night.